This episode of the Beta Files, we're looking at the history of the media since CNN, part of the ongoing series, The Hate Machine. So, hang on to your diapies, babies. I'm the barber. This is the Beta Files. All right, so, excuse me, start over. And 3, 2, 1. Hey guys, what's going on? All right, so today we're just going to, it's more of an observational history. What I remember happening during the 80s and 90s and how I remember everything growing. So this isn't going to be like 100% technically accurate. Again, it's going off memory. My memory's not exactly 100%, but I did look up a few of the dates just to make sure that I've got everything in line, so you can double check the thing. But you can always go and put this stuff together on your own as far as like exactly when something happened. Sorry, I'm getting all kinds of text messages. But you can always go and put all these things together on your own if you really want to see exactly when what happened. But looking at the larger scale, over the past 40 years since CNN's been on the air, a lot has changed. A lot has definitely changed from what news was before CNN and what news was after CNN, and then what news was before Fox News and after Fox News, and how these two different major, well, not major event. Well, I guess you could say major events. If you're looking at media, it would be a major event. But these two significant events, the starting of CNN and the starting of Fox News, and how it kind of changed the entire dynamic of how we get our news, all the way down to the local news, because local news even employs a lot of this stuff too. And one of the things that Matt Taibbi talks about in his book is how they started adapting some of the strategies of like the NFL and the NBA in sports. And I got to thinking about that the other day, and he's absolutely right. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And we'll also talk about the smaller magazine shows like Inside Edition and Current Affair and Entertainment Tonight, and eventually Access Hollywood, which came along later, and how that affected it, because it all just kind of connects together to give us the world that we have now in our media landscape. So starting out in 1980, and some of you probably already know this history, but in 1980 CNN goes on the air. 80 was a big year. MTV came on in 1980. CNN hit in 1980. Later, I think it was 84, 85 is when we start to see other channels, that other specialty channels come on the air, like Discovery and that kind of thing. I think A&E was in the early years, like 82, 83, I think, if I remember correctly. I may be wrong about that, but I know it was one of the early ones as well. And then, of course, later, with the success of Entertainment Tonight, you get E! And Bravo and all that. Bravo was later, too. I think Bravo was the 90s. But anyway, so CNN comes on the news or comes on the air, and one of the things about CNN was it was news 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. what had happened and what I've gathered just from being a student of history and kind of looking at these kind of things, by the 1980s, well, really by the 1970s, the idea of an evening edition newspaper has started to fall a little bit. The newspaper, the journalists, the news agencies that were putting out the newspapers were starting to lose money by the 70s on the evening editions, okay? So you start to see a scale back of doing 2 papers a day. A lot of that had to do with TV, right? By the 70s, the evening news landscape had pretty much been solidified. There had been evening news in the 50s and 60s, but by the time you get to the 70s, it had become, with the local stations and then the national stations, it had become a part of our culture. And so it just kind of, you don't need the evening edition then. What that does is it opens up the possibility for a channel like CNN, because now there's a hole. Even though people had scaled back on how much they needed, or as a culture we needed an evening edition, we start to see the desire still for news that was more readily available. And you got to remember, this is before the internet, so we weren't able to hop on Google and check the headlines. So we get to 1980, and Ted Turner has this idea of putting on a 24-hour news channel. And in the early years, CNN was immediately from the gates phenomenal at reporting news. They put a lot of money, they invested a lot in reporters internationally and nationally. They were able to cover stories that go more in depth with stories that I don't know why that just popped up. Go more in depth with stories that the evening news wasn't able to do, and the local news stations weren't able to finance. So here's CNN with a pretty decent budget, being able to cover stuff that the other news corporations just didn't have the money to do. And they're able to produce basically what we were getting with the Times and the Post and all that, for a TV audience, okay? And all of a sudden they had better reach than the larger newspapers did, because of the fact that they were on TV, and because you have one organization broadcasting everywhere instead of having to rely on a distribution network of getting the papers out as quickly as possible in all areas of the country, different regions from where the newspaper actually is, as in the case with something like the Chicago Tribune or the New York Times or the Washington Post or the LA Times for that matter. But by 1982, it had become clear that CNN was starting to focus on specialized content, or the beginnings of focusing on that specialized content. And that has a lot to do with Larry King Live and the success of Larry King Live. But they started to shift into this idea of doing specialized content, and that's when you see HLN come in. So Headline News becomes the second 24-hour news network, and all the original template for HLN is just every half hour they run through the headlines, and that's it. So you're getting, no matter what time of day it is, if you turn it on at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, you're going to get a half hour of just nothing but headlines. You turn it on at 10 o'clock at night, you're going to get a half hour of headlines. You turn it on at 3 in the morning, you're going to get a half hour of headlines. And so it didn't matter what time of day, you're going to get a solid block of headlines that focused on what had happened that day. And what that does, of course, is alleviate some of the pressure from CNN so they can start focusing on the specialized content that they were starting to work on. And for a very long time, it's CNN and Headline News. And I remember somewhere in the early to mid 80s is when we get C-SPAN. And And of course, C-SPAN allows us to see what's happening on Capitol Hill in real time, right? So, and you wouldn't really call that a news network. It's not like it is today. And we only had one C-SPAN. There wasn't like 3 or 4 of them. There was just the one. And of course, ESPN at this point is just getting started. They're getting their stuff together. But anyway, so that lasts for a long time. It's just those two. And I want to say that at some point there was another news network that tried to get going, but it didn't work. And I can't remember for life of me what it was. But throughout the 1980s, while CNN had this monopoly on cable news, what's happening on daytime TV, you start to see in those daytime TV shows during the 1980s, the templates for what we would end up with today as far as these morning time and early afternoon time style shows, right? And of course, I'm talking about Phil Donahue, Sally Jesse Raphael, Geraldo, and then eventually Ricky Lake and Maury, and trying to think, and then you get the extreme and Jerry Springer. We'll get to that in a minute. But it starts off with Donahue, who became very successful and his show was very, and of course we end up with Oprah out of this too. And we'll get to that in a second. But it starts off with Phil Donahue. And Donahue, from what I remember, and there's probably ones before Donahue that I knew nothing about, but what I remember is Donahue was the big one. And basically the show was Donahue would pick a topic. He would bring in experts. He would bring in, if it was something that needed witnesses, or he would bring, people who had seen an event or had been part of an event or had been part of some kind of, whatever the story was. If they had anything to do with the story, he would bring them in. And then sometimes he'd have national figures on there, or he'd have celebrities on there, and he would interview them, that kind of thing. And so Donahue was huge. And Donahue's show, he presented himself as kind of a common sense kind of guy. And in the 1980s, from what I remember as a child, and I may be completely wrong, but from what I remember, there wasn't as much liberal pushback to a lot of the Reagan-esque style values. Now, there was pushback. It just wasn't as much as today. Like you wouldn't see, like you see today, where you have these liberals on TV just talking about how stupid Trump is. You would never see that in the 80s from what I remember. From what I remember, when they would get mad at Reagan about something, you never heard them call him stupid or idiotic. I do remember towards the end of his presidency, they started questioning his mental capabilities, but it was not to the point where we've seen with Trump, and not what we saw with Obama, and not what we saw with GW. Okay, these past 3 presidents. And really, that kind of, and I'm jumping ahead of myself a little bit, but that kind of reporting, that style of reporting, didn't happen until the late years of the Clinton administration, when Fox News has come onto the scene. And we'll talk about the Lewinsky trial here in a minute, because that's basically how Fox News takes over, is because of Lewinsky. But anyway, so you have the Phil Donahue, you have Sally Jesse Raphael, who kind of fills in that section with Donahue as well. And then, of course, Geraldo, when we look at Donahue and Sally Jesse Raphael, were, if you look at them, they were supposed to be the more serious ones. Geraldo was a little bit more sensational. And you can see, if you trace how Jerry Springer actually comes to be, and Montel Williams, and Maury and Ricky Lake, which they all came later. But you can see the seeds of those style shows from Geraldo, because Geraldo was really good at making something sensational, and he really hyped things. One of the biggest gaffes in news history that we hardly ever talk about is Geraldo's huge special on the Al Capone vault, and they hype this thing, and they do this whole history of Al Capone, which some of it was pretty fascinating. But then they get to the point where they open up the vault and it's just completely empty. And so poor Geraldo had to deal with that for a while. But then you have so you can see the seeds of Jerry Springer and all them with Geraldo. And that's kind of the direction it goes in by the time we get to the late 80s and early 90s, with the exception of Oprah, the lone exception. And what Oprah does is she takes it and turns it into this really cool format. And she's following the same. When Oprah first starts out, she's doing the same thing that Donahue and Raphael are doing, right? But as she gets bigger and as she starts to get syndicated more and more stations pick her up, she starts to change her format a little bit, and it becomes more of a personal thing. Whereas with Donahue and Raphael, it's not exactly news coverage, but it's not on a personal level. It's kind of somewhere in between, if that makes sense. So Oprah comes along, and of course she builds an entire empire off of her daytime talk show. And of course, none of the talk shows that we see today are anything like these shows were back in the 80s and 90s. Okay, I think Wendy Williams is probably the closest to the original format, but if you look at Ellen and The View or The Talk, it's not. They've gone in a different direction. We'll talk about that too, because I think The View completely changed everything as far as daytime talk show after cable news picked up the template and ran with it. So then by the early 90s, you get, as far as news and stuff, you start to see a swell with Entertainment Tonight. And this, as celebrity culture, we've always been fascinated with celebrity culture, but I think you'd be hard-pressed not to say that two big figures had to do with our overinvestment in celebrity culture. And one of them was Princess Diana, and the fascination with her. And then the other would be Michael Jackson, and just how insanely enormous he became. Regardless of what we have found out about Michael, to understand, I don't think there's a single person right now that is that even comes close to being as famous as Michael was. Michael Jackson was huge, and you can't underscore just how immensely popular that man became. And then the same thing with Princess Di. Both of them were very popular, not just here in the States, but internationally. We fell in love with Di. I remember the big thing was Di's wedding to Charles in like 81, I think, 80 or 81. And it was broadcast over here like it was our royal family. I mean, it was huge. And of course, we saw it again with Fergie and was it Andrew, which is Chuck's little brother. But anyway, he's in hot water over the Epstein mess. But not Chuck. Andrew. Drew. They're not my princes, so who cares? Anyway, So between Di and MJ, Michael Jackson. I better not say MJ because that's Jordan. And Jordan is another one, right? Jordan, by the mid-90s, Jordan is the most famous athlete in the world. And I doubt you're going to... You'd make a hard argument. I think the only people who have come close to impacting their sport the way Jordan did, well, you could say Babe Ruth absolutely did. Ruth and Jordan... Ruth probably more than Jordan, just looking back, but that's a whole debate for another day. But you could probably argue that Brady, unfortunately, Brady and Roger Federer, they've come close to doing what Jordan did, but I don't think they're there yet. And LeBron's not. And I know that's probably going to anger a lot of people, but LeBron's got a way to go to if he's going to impact the sport the way Jordan did. And I'm not talking statistics, right? And that's one of the things about The Last Dance is you get a taste of what it was like to live during Jordan's time. But going back to the early 90s, it's Di and Michael Jackson, and we get this huge fascination with them, and the Entertainment Tonight style shows take off. And of course, like I said, you end up with Entertainment Television shortly after that. And then while all of that is happening between the daytime talk shows and the Entertainment Tonights and CNN 24-hour news, you get these tabloid shows. And now the tabloid shows are nothing new, right? I mean, I think Deborah Norville is still on Inside Edition. But there in the late 80s, mid to late 80s, we started getting these half-hour shows that originally, well, here in North Carolina, I don't know about anywhere else in the country, but most of the time here in our side of the state, they would run right before the evening news. And so you'd have the tabloid show and then the real news. And then after the real news went off, and you got the local news and then the nightly news, and then at 7 o'clock, you would get the entertainment news. So you get Entertainment Tonight at like 7:30, I think. And then at 7 o'clock, they'd show something else. But I remember originally Inside Edition would come on at 5:30, and then the show called Current Affair came on. And there were several others. And at this time, the same time that all this is starting to pop up, you end up with Cops, right? And so you're getting all these different avenues of real life and how people live. And shortly after all this, we get, in the early 90s, we end up with The Real World on MTV. And then shortly after that, you get Survivor. And so all these different things are culminating, okay? Now, I'm not going to pretend that I have any idea of what Roger Ailes was thinking. What I know is that Rupert Murdoch decided to buy 20th Century Fox, and he wanted to do an all-news channel like CNN. And we'll talk about MSNBC here in just a minute, but what I do know from what I've read and what I've heard over the years and that kind of stuff, Roger Ailes set out to make a news network that was the push to the mainstream's pull, if that makes sense. He knew and he understood there was an entire demographic of people out there that did not fully trust the New York Times, did not fully trust NBC or CBS or ABC, and did not fully trust CNN. And you have to remember, by the time Fox News comes along in the mid-90s, Chomsky's already written his book and has gone through all the controversy of manufacturing consent. And so there's already like this, even if people didn't even know who Chomsky was, the talk about liberal bias, the conservatives took the liberal newspapers to task, and of course the idea of liberal bias in the news and that kind of thing. And look, this guy is actually pointing it out with Chomsky. So you fast forward to about 1996, and 2 news stations show up on cable news, and one of them is Fox News, and the other's what would become MSNBC. Now, what I remember is at first, NBC did have like an all-news channel, like NBC News or something like that. And then somehow, I don't know who did it or how he got roped into it, but Bill Gates took Microsoft had a their own little news thing that they had, and it was called MSN, and you could go, like, when you would get updates on Explorer, it would automatically default to MSN as the homepage. So somehow he gets involved with NBC, and they have this shared interest called it ends up becoming MSNBC. But it was called something else before that. And I want to say it was like NBC News or I can't remember. But it hadn't been on long when they changed it to MSNBC. Then, and then of course there's Fox News. Now, when MSNBC first comes on, they basically copied CNN. CNN had evolved at that point. CNN did not, of 1996, 95, 96, 97, did not look like CNN of 1980 to 85. So there was a lot of change there. But Fox didn't copy the CNN model. Going back to Roger Ailes, there's a couple of things that we know for sure about Roger Ailes. Like I said, number one, he wanted to present the opposite side of the story. Not necessarily in a good way, not necessarily in a bad way, but he just wanted to present the opposite side. And the second thing is, we know is that he employed all these different strategies into Fox News to get the most money possible from advertisers. Here's the thing about the news business, and this is something that Chomsky talks about, Taibbi talks about, several different people have talked about it over the years. Since the Vietnam War, the news industry has gotten further and further away from production of news and closer and closer to the production of ads. Okay? In other words, it's a marketing mechanism. All right? So if you look at news in the 40s and 50s and into the 60s, the main generator that's pushing the news cycle is news. Whereas if you look at it in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and even blatantly today, the main generator of news is ad revenue. It's not just the ad revenue, because the way that the marketing structure has changed in the past 10 years, but since the digital revolution, 15 years, what you see is corporations have gotten even more involved now than they've ever been. They were heavily involved in the 80s. There's a huge conglomeration during the 70s and 80s as they start to just swallow up these smaller companies, and they get bigger and bigger and bigger. And what they end up doing is buying, instead of one massive Hirsch empire, you have like five or six massive Hirsch style empires by the end of the 90s. Between 1980 and 2000, they just keep consolidating and just eating up everything. So that, give you an example, in 1985, the year my wife was born, Time and Warner were two separate companies. And what's interesting is that, and I want to say, I don't think Time Warner was, that Time had bought Warner Brothers yet when Batman came out in '89. I think that was still just Warner Brothers. But I do remember when Warner Brothers was bought out by Time, and you have the birth of Time Warner, and I remember when Time Warner Cable showed up, and it was like, wait a minute, isn't that the studio? And I have a point to this, I promise. There are people on this planet that have never known the existence of Time and Warner Brothers separately, right? It's kind of the same thing with Viacom and CBS, right? I know they just got back together, but for the longest, Viacom and CBS were together for a long time before they made the split, and now that they're back together, it's almost like, oh, look, the family's back together. But they don't remember a time where, even though there was a short period there where they weren't together, but if you look back in the 80s and 90s, it was Viacom, CBS, right? I mean, it's just little things like that. So anyway, so it's just this, I'm babbling now. This consolidation of all the different news outlets. What's that got to do with Fox News? Well, Murdoch, who had just bought all these different media companies across the world, kind of consolidated everything in his own little empire. And what Fox News was the front for his American operations. That sounds so cynical. Let me point something out real quick. There's no conspiracy here. It's greed. It's just straight up greed. It is get as much as you can, gobble it up by a small group of people. Okay? One of the problems with the Chomsky book is that it lends itself to conspiracy theory, right? It's not a conspiracy theory, but it lends itself to conspiracy theories. And something like Taibbi's Hate Inc. does the same thing. It lends itself to that. Even though all they're doing is saying, this is what actually happens. And there's actually, I saw a clip of Chomsky talking about this. It's very easy to do this, because what you do is you present the template. You feed the template only specific information, then everybody kind of takes that template with that specific information and spreads it, and that's how you control the narrative. And there's no little cabal sitting in a room in a New York high-rise that's determining what the news is. You have within the organizations, you have, okay, what is going to benefit us, what is going to sell more papers, what would actually turn people off of the news if we printed it. That's what drives it. It's not a conspiracy to take over your life or anything. It's a conspiracy. It's not even a conspiracy to get your money. It's just greed. That's all it is. Okay, so none of this is a conspiracy. None of this is conspiratorial. What I want to talk about and kind of put all the pieces together for you is to show you how we got to where we are now. Because if you go back and watch any of the CNN coverage from those first few years, it's boring. It's I remember being a kid thinking, why would anybody want to watch this? And then when headline news came out, and it was like rapid fire boredom instead of slow boredom. It was just bad. But that's what news is supposed to be. It's not supposed to be sensational. So we get to 96 and we get to Roger Ailes. And like I said, he's got two different things. He wants to give a different storyline, present the opposite of what's being told in the quote-unquote liberal press. And he wants to make a lot. He wants to get as much money as possible. So if you look at, and I'm not saying that Roger Ailes sat down and said, okay, if we look at what has been popular since CNN went on the air to now, and we put all those things together and throw them on Fox News. I don't think that's what he did. I don't think anybody in Fox's organization did that. But by the time Fox comes along, all these different things I was talking about before with the Donahues and the Inside Editions and the Ricky Lakes and the Jerry Springers and the Geraldos and all that, what Roger Ailes was able to do, and the success of Oprah, she has a huge impact on Fox News, whether she realizes it or not. But what he does is he takes kind of like the temperature of the culture at the time, and by the culture itself, through all those different means, had developed a specific taste. And so Roger Ailes gave it to him. And it's you hear so many different funny takes on the quote-unquote fair and balanced. Well, originally it was you report, or we report, you decide, and then it changed to fair and balanced. Of course, the joke is that it's not actually fair or balanced, but neither is the liberal side, right? There's no balance. And that what Ailes was actually pointing out was the imbalance in news coverage. It was kind of like a tongue-in-cheek joke. But what Fox News ends up doing is, if the left says right, then if the left says green, then we're going to say blue, right? Or, now let me rethink that analogy. If the left says yellow, we'll say blue, when really the story is green. There we go. So that's actually pretty good. I like that. I may have to write that down. But anyway, so that's what he's doing. He's just giving the opposite. Now, MSNBC, when it first comes on, is not the liberal soccer mom home for news that it is today, right? Where the liberal left comes for comfort, right? It's not that. I will say Oberman has a lot to do with that later. That and Chris Matthews. Chris Matthews masquerading as a true political. He's supposed to be like Tim Russert, only on steroids, like literally, because he's screaming, where Tim Russert talked. But anyway, so what Ailes does is he notes, and you can see this in you can see it today. He takes all this, the taste, like I said, that had been created by all these different styles of shows, and he puts it in one network and sticks it on the air. And after the first couple years where they fuss about the fact that there's too much conservative bias, you're just, you're showing your blue card or your red card there with the Republican Party. He decides, okay, well, and they come up with this ingenious way to do this. They come up with they get Greta Van Susteren from CNN and put her on Fox News. And then later they get Shep Smith. That's what it is. And they stick him on Fox News. And they're like, look, we do have balance. See, these two people are liberal. And I remember there's a clip of Rupert Murdoch out there somewhere where a reporter asks him, what do you say about conservative bias on Fox News? And he says, there's no conservative bias. We have Greta Van Susteren. Like, that just solves all the problems. For 1 hour a day, they were liberal, and then the other 23 hours didn't matter. And we'll talk about Hannity and Combs in a minute. Because there's one thing that Fox News didn't do, that they didn't make famous, but they did perfect it, and that is the quote unquote debate show, right? And which would evolve. It has since evolved. And CNN didn't invent it either. There were several different styles of these debate shows. Debate shows during the 60s and 70s, and it was so rancid that SNL, of course, parodied it with Dan Aykroyd and Jane Curtin. And of course, if you've never seen it, you need to, because it's hilarious, where they're arguing over some actor. and something that the actor had done or worn or something. And it's just a whole, almost 10 minutes of them just insulting each other. And that was the parody, and it was pointing that out. But of course, it didn't stop it. Saturday Night Live doesn't have the power that we think it has. They do bring a lot of attention to different things, but as far as swinging culture, they don't have that kind of power. Which is why it's so funny when people get all upset over Saturday Night Live doing something. It's like they don't actually have the power you think they do. But anyway, so you see, if you look at the early Fox, and even today, like I said, you see how all those different components that have been spread out across the media landscape during the 1980s and 1990s had come together. And he was able to fulfill that taste, that desire. And he created what's known as the Fox effect. Because the other thing that Roger Ailes realized, when you sit down and you watch an NFL or NBA contest, long before the MLB did it, long before the NCAA did it, it was the NBA and the NFL that used these bright graphics, and they drew your attention in, and they had very colorful commentary. They started to cross boundaries in their coverage of a player. They would start asking, what does he think? One of the funniest things is Frank... I can't remember his last name now, but the guy who does the Madden impression. And one of the funniest things I've ever heard was he was doing a Madden impression and said, here's a guy, when he puts his glasses on, he can see better. But and he's mocking John Madden, but at the same time, he's also pointing to a fact that we started to get personal with our athletes. We started to expect them to be personal with us, to give us a glimpse into their life. What's it like to be a Michael Jordan? When Jordan had the gambling scandal in the early 90s, I think it was 93 or 94, everybody was just so upset. Why? You wanted to see how human he was. He is human, and he has this gambling thing. Why are you... That doesn't make any sense, but whatever. It's never made any sense to me when we pry and pry and pry into these people's lives, and then when we find something that makes them human, that makes them weak, we cry foul, which is just ridiculous. But the sports had gotten to that point where we were starting to get more personal with our athletes. Again, the graphics were bright, they were big, so you could see it, so you can understand everything. And Elle said, And so you start getting the Fox effect, the beginnings of what would become known as the Fox effect. The bright graphics, getting personal with the people, looking into the background of their lives. There was a huge scandal in the late 80s, I believe. This man named Gary Hart, and he was like the promise of the Democratic Party. He was going to save us from the Reaganites, right? And this is before Dukakis, right? In fact, it's because of Gary Hart's scandal that Dukakis ends up getting the nomination. But they found out that Gary Hart had an affair. We find out that Trump has an affair, and we're like, well, of course he did. But back then, shock, and as part of that, and Els catches on to that too, is this idea of let's dig into people's past. Let's find out what's going on. So all of that starts to add up. And then, as if by like some kind of divine intervention for Fox News, the Lewinsky scandal broke. And this is what made Fox News. And during the Lewinsky scandal, all of the things that they had just kind of been piecing together and exploring kind of just made sense, right? And because now you have the chyron at the bottom that's talking about like prosecutors looking into the stains on Lewinsky's dress. It's like, oh, seriously? What a headline, right? And of course, at the top, you've got breaking news, and there's no breaking news, right? But they're going to put breaking news up there to make you think there's breaking news. And of course, they do the graphics and the NFL style, competition logos and that kind of thing. And of course, the headlines are getting more and more abrasive. They're getting more and more pointed, right? Everything you see on cable news today is a product of them watching Fox News develop their personality as a network during the Lewinsky scandal. And after that, MSNBC, you see the shift in MSNBC and CNN dramatically after that. And like I said, it's not till Oberman that MSNBC becomes in-your-face liberal. For a long time, they kind of stayed away from it. But then when they put Oberman up against O'Reilly, all gloves were off by that point, because people had accused Chris Matthews, but they could argue, that no, he's not that liberal. I mean, look how he treats these Democrats and that kind of thing, which is all show anyway, because none of it's real. Because again, it's all about marketing. It's all about getting your money. And Fox News perfected it. And Roger Ailes won the war. So, and of course you can see, and like I said, you can see all of this from what we were learning in the 1980s, from the beginning of CNN all the way up to the birth of Fox News. All of the different things that Fox News popularized for news coverage, quote unquote news coverage, you can see it in the 80s and early 90s in different areas of our culture. And all they did was just take and adapt them, because that's what the culture wanted. The culture wanted these things. To the point where, and I forgot to mention, three other major events happened right before Fox News goes on the air that also pretty much sealed the deal and brought CNN to a new level of coverage that we'd never seen before, and frankly is just abhorrent. But you had the Menendez brothers, the John Wayne Bobbitt, and the Bobbitt case. We'll just call it the Bobbitt case, where she cut off his pecker. And then, of course, the coup de grace, which was Simpson. Give you an idea of how they hype this. So Court TV comes along, and what Court TV is going to do is give you this inside look into some of the biggest high-profile cases. And I can't remember which one was first, whether it was the Menendez trial or the Bobbitt trial. But it was one of the two. And it was when the first one happened, that's when CNN started paying attention to, wait a minute, what about these high-profile nonsense cases? Because it was just nonsense. Nobody really cares about them. Nobody cared about these people. All right? The thing about the Bobbitt case, the fact that she cut it off, that's why people were watching. They wanted to see if we would get justice for the man who got his thing cut off. With the Menendez brothers, you have a couple of, I don't want to dumb it down, but basically you have a couple of brats, spoiled brats, that wanted more, and they killed their mom and dad. And then, of course, with O.J., it's the legendary football player, O.J. Simpson. When you look at what outside of O.J., when you look at the Bobbitt case and the Menendez brothers, and there were others, there was the young lady, the little girl, there was a little beauty pageant girl who disappeared, and I don't think they still have not figured that one out. That was the big one. John Benet Ramsey. Is that right? Yeah. And they would run these stories for weeks. And you know how it is because they do this stuff. They, the most recent was the riots, and they've started to back off the riots. Have you noticed that? The riots haven't stopped. Not the riots. Let me back. I shouldn't say riots. The protests. The protests have not stopped. The protests are still going, but they've backed off of them because it's old news. And now they're refocusing on COVID because the numbers are going up. But the numbers were going up during the protests, right? So, because I remember during the protests, they were talking about the numbers going up from Memorial Day weekend. But now it's like the focus is on that, and every day there's a new freaking poll out about, the presidential race, and we're still, 7 months? No. Is it 7 months? Let's see. 5 months. 5 months out. So it's still too early to say who's going to win, but because Biden has got on average a double-digit lead from all these different polls, they're already calling it. These people don't learn. They called it with Hillary, and he won. And of course they're saying, no, this is different because this is double digits. And they even brought up. I was watching a clip this morning, and the person who was talking about the poll was like, he's even beating Obama at this point from 2008 and 2012. I'm like, really, guys, we're getting the Obama out. Is that what we're gonna do? Gonna drag old Obama out of the closet? Okay. Anyway, all right. So after after Fox does that, like I said, MSNBC and CNN kind of, fall in line with it and go after it and realize there's a ton of money to be made in cable news. And like I said, CNN figures this out, but doesn't know how to really cash in on it until Fox gives them the template. Because of the major court cases that are happening in the early 90s where they do just 24-hour coverage of something that we just don't care about. But they end up making us care about it. And we become, as a culture, we become obsessed with this, right? With this this young Hispanic young lady who had been mistreated by her husband, and she got revenge. She got the ultimate revenge, and it should have been a page 6 story, something that you chuckle about with your buddies and say, wow, she got him, and that should have been the end of it. But instead it turned into this almost year-long drama that they covered religiously and just didn't let up. And the same thing with the Menendez brothers. Should have been a page 6 story that you read and say, oh my God, these kids were brats, and move on with your life. It should not have been a national obsession. But CNN figured out, like I said, Court TV was the ones that started the coverage, and then of course CNN caught on real quick and made it an obsession, right? And so by the time Fox News comes along, they need some kind of obsession like that, and Lewinsky happens, and Fox News. That's when Fox News gets on the map. Now, I mentioned the debate-style shows, and I'm going to end on the debate-style shows because one of the most infamous two of the most infamous is Crossfire and Handy and Combs. And there have been dozens of others, okay? These are not the only ones, but these are the two big ones. Now, Crossfire was CNN's, and Crossfire had started in the mid-'80s. After the invention of headline news, CNN started to focus on specialty content, and one of the specialty content shows they had was this Crossfire show. And the idea was you had a liberal get pitched against a conservative, and they supposedly, quote unquote, debated political things. And of course, Crossfire goes through multiple different pairs to what you end up with later with Tucker Carlson, which is the last iteration of Crossfire. And of course, if you don't know about it, you ought to go Google it or go on YouTube and find it, where Jon Stewart basically went on Crossfire and shut it down. I think Crossfire was on for only like 2 more weeks after, and I may be wrong on that. I just know they shut it down shortly after that, permanently, or supposedly permanently. I think they tried to bring it back at one point. But Stewart went on and just ripped into him and said, you're hurting us by doing this. But of course, nobody cares. Hannity and Combs was Fox News's version, and kind of like the same formula. You had a very big, strong conservative arguing with a weak little liberal, and it was just it. The point of those shows was to reinforce the division lines, okay? And the whole point of this particular episode of the BetaFiles is to get to that, to show you, to explain how the division line works. Because we talked a little bit about it in the Hate Machine Part 1. But now with Taibbi's 10 Rules of Hate. But where, they sow this division to sell news, right? You can't sell news if you can't sell as much news if everybody is complacent, right? If there's no us versus them, right? The more you up the us versus them, the better. And so what we see with CNN in the early years before Fox News, CNN is not doing the us versus them narrative. CNN instead is trying to find that unique ability to sell the news, because here's the thing, by the time Fox News comes along, CNN was on the decline. Not as many people were watching CNN because my generation came through and we're like, this is boring. And so you can blame the extras. Well, you can blame the boomers and the extras. The boomers bit into the Fox News bug, and then of course we ended up biting into the MSNBC bug. And I was an avid viewer of MSNBC for a long time, until it got to. I'll put it to you like this: the most recent that I regularly watched MSNBC ended about 9-10 months ago, because I was still watching. Like, I still like Chuck Todd. I don't think he can be a little whiny, but he can also be really good. He's really good at doing interviews. He is no Tim Russert, but I think Chuck Todd would tell you I'm no Tim Russert. But I was watching. This is what got me to stop. I'd had enough with MSNBC, with this one episode of AM Joy, and it was a Sunday morning, and I'm watching AM Joy, and they had Jennifer Rubin from the Washington Post on. If you don't know anything about Jennifer Rubin, she's an op-ed writer for the Post and several others, I think, smaller ones, but the Washington Post is where she gets her biggest byline. And they were talking about police brutality, the same conversation we're having now. And Jennifer Rubin basically blamed everything on the South. And Joy Reid agreed with her, and I said, fuck you. And I turned it off. And that was pretty much the day that I realized MSNBC has now finally completely crossed into that area that Fox News operated in. And it's not like MSNBC wasn't already in there. They just hadn't gone full yet. But at that moment, I realized, no, they've gone full on. They're there. So Anyway, so, but like I said, up until Fox News, CNN wasn't trying to divide anything. CNN was just basically trying to figure out how to sell you more news. And they tried several different things that obviously didn't work. Fox News came along and said, no, this is how you do it. You pit one side against the other. I mean, we've been doing this for so long, guys. And Fox News just oversimplified the process for everybody else. And then MSNBC, like I said, later catches on and says, okay, this is how we get ratings. We pit ourselves against those. And like I said, Oberman is the moment that you see MSNBC go super liberal. Up to that point, they were like skirting along the liberal lines, but it's Oberman that kind of takes them over. And what's interesting is Tucker Carlson ends up on MSNBC after he leaves CNN. And he's kind of like their Greta Van Susteren, you know, hey, look, we do have a conservative. We're not all liberal. But now they just don't even try. You know, they've got, well, I take that back. They've got Nicole Wallace on there now, but it's kind of like what Jay was talking about with Joe Scarborough. It's window dressing, right? It's not real. Nicole Wallace is just as liberal as anybody else on that network. Probably not as liberal as Matt Al, or Chris Hayes, but she's liberal enough. And then you flip over, you know, with Shep Smith gone, I don't even know who is trying to fill the liberal role at Fox News, if there's even anybody there that's supposed to be filling that role. Whatever. All right. So, and that's basically, it's Fox News. It's the Fox effect. Let me back up, because you can't just blame Fox News. Like I said, leading up to the moment of Fox News, Els is seeing this desire from the American public through all these other platforms, through all these other different styles of shows that had been very popular or come to popularity during the 80s and 90s. And so it's not like they invented it. They just put everything. They were the first ones to figure out the formula. And once they figured out the formula, it was easy to get the others in line to use the same formula, because it's all about money. It's all about the ratings. Fox News is kicking our butts. How do we get some of those ratings back? Well, let's do what they're doing. Let's put our own spin on it. And thus you have cable news today. So if you want to have some fun, go on YouTube or some kind of archive, go back and check out all those different types of shows. The morning shows from the early afternoon talk shows from the 1980s, the Donahues, the Sally Jesse Raphaels, the Geraldos. And then watch the ones from the 90s during the Springer era, with the Ricky Lakes and the Montel Williams and Maury Povich. And really watch an episode of Geraldo and then watch them and then watch Fox News, and you can see it. It's very fascinating. And same thing with those tabloid shows. Go back and watch Bill O'Reilly on Inside Edition. And watch, I'm trying to remember the guy who was on A Current Affair. I cannot remember him. And then go watch Mary Hart on Entertainment Tonight and John Tesh. And there's the upbeat entertainment portion of cable news, right? There's E. But more importantly, there's the obsession. You start to see the seeds of that obsession that the cable news channels will exploit tremendously in the 1990s. And of course, till today. And I'll end on this. I've said this before. This is nothing new for me. And again, this isn't conspiracy theories. This is understanding, that there's no great, like I said, cabal sitting up on the 7th floor somewhere or 70th floor somewhere, like planning all this out. No, that's not what it is. It's just greed. It's just greed. It's want of money. How much money can we get? The more money we get, the more powerful we are. The more powerful we are, the more money we need. It's just a vicious cycle. right? But years ago, the day that I realized, I'll never forget it, the day I realized that this is all a bunch of bullshit, was I'm watching MSNBC. I'm watching Andrea Mitchell, who is doing a really, really good interview with a Pentagon official over the defense budget. Now, obviously, you're not going to get all the black and white details of the defense budget in a 11-minute clip from a 1-hour afternoon news show on a cable news channel. But she was asking really good questions, because Andrea Mitchell is a good reporter, or used to be a good reporter. And she was asking a lot of really good questions, this guy. And about 3/4 of the way through the interview, she stops and she says, "We have breaking news." And I'm thinking, oh my God, something bad has happened. Because she's interrupting this interview with this dude to cut to breaking news. And they cut to Lindsay Lohan walking out of the freaking courthouse with a piece of paper over her face, when she's already wearing sunglasses, like, we don't know who you are, Lindsay. But I'm sitting there and I saw that and I thought, oh my God. That was my red pill moment. When it comes to this, and I realize, I'm like, this is all bullshit. They're going to cut from a serious conversation. And again, you're not going to get everything in 11 minutes. But you're going to get some good information, especially from a seasoned reporter like Andrea Mitchell. No, we're going to go and look at Lindsay Lohan walk out of a courthouse, because it is much more fascinating and you get much more eyeballs when somebody's life is being ruined on national television. All right, so that is, I hope this made sense. Again, it was an observational history. It was, this is not meant to be like 100% factual. Like I said, you can go back and look at the actual days and times and exactly when things happened. But just from what I remember, just looking at the culture back over the past 40 years since CNN, this is what I've observed. And it looks, and you can see it all the things I saw when I was a kid in the 80s. And then, of course, when I was coming of age in the 90s. You see it on cable news now. Every trick, every tip, every trick, every banner, every graphic. It's all right there. It came somewhere in the 80s. You'll be able to find it on these different platforms, right? And I meant to talk about like the things like The View and The Talk. They are reinventions because cable news stole Donahue's model. And so you're not going to compete with the cable news channels where they can they can set up and run a 24-hour-a-day channel that's showing the Donahue model. You're not going to compete with that. So what happens with The View is they show, here's a different model that we can try, and it's working. Because now you got The View and The Talk and the doctors and I don't know what else, the dumbasses. So anyway, so there you go. All right, that's it for today. Next week, we're going to have much lighter topics. I promise you that, because next week, the Optic Poet is doing Gen X TV. And so Wednesday's BetaFile show is actually going to tie into that, where I'm going to be looking at what happened to G.I. Joe and Transformers. What happened? And not as in, where did they go, but what happened to those storylines and those narratives, because they're gone. We don't have those narratives anymore. They're gone. And the idea of good versus evil, right, with the Decepticons and G.I. Joe, but evil's never killed. And my son wrote a wonderful piece on our blog called "Why Batman Shouldn't Kill." and he talks about that's part of the character. And one of the things about Transformers and what made the Transformers movie so controversial for people my age was that they killed Optimus Prime. Spoiler alert. And I'm not talking about the Shia LaBeouf. I'm talking about the original Transformers animated movie that came out in 1986. It was huge because and obviously looking back on it now as an adult, I know what they were doing. They were getting ready to relaunch the toy line. But back then it was earth shattering because it's the death of Optimus Prime. So, and the transformation of Megatron into Galvatron, which was just crazy. They went from a gun to a cannon, a space cannon. The lightsaber effect, I guess. So we're going to talk about that. And then, of course, with G.I. Joe, Cobra, and Joe, and all those battles that we saw on weekday afternoons, and nobody died until the G.I. Joe movie. Right? And then the live action one had the audacity to kill Duke. Spoiler alert. So anyway, so we're going to talk about, what happened. When did that change? And then for text messages from the living room, we're going to be talking about toys. I'm going to be talking about my, what toys I had. My wife's going to talk about the toys that she had, and we'll have my sons on as well, and they'll be able to talk about the toys that they had. So you'll get 3 different perspectives from 3 different generations about the different toys. And so that's all Tuesday, Wednesday, and Tuesday and Wednesday of next week. Now See This Here Now Then is going to tackle social media again. And then Friday, we'll see what happens for the BetaFiles next Friday. So anyway, so there's our lineup for next week if you're interested. Again, Optic Poet on Tuesday. Text messages from the living room on Wednesday. Now See This Here Now Then on Thursday. And, of course, the BetaFiles on Wednesday and Friday of of every week. Right here wherever you're hearing us. Everything else, if you're curious about the other shows, you can just go to our blog, www.thebetafiles.com. All of our content's up there. You can check it out. And you can also find where they are on other media platforms. But everything is housed on the blog. So you can go out and see or listen. All right? Make it a great day. And remember, as long as the sun comes up, there's opportunity. So take it. I'm the Barber. This has been the Beta Files.